Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Budget Response with Shadow Treasurer Jim Chalmers MP, where Jim will provide the opposition's response to the government's budget and their rationale for it. My name's Jarrod Ball and I'm the Chief Economist at CEDA, the Committee for Economic Development of Australia. CEDA acknowledges that today and every day we are on Aboriginal land. We're committed to recognition and reconciliation. We respect elders and we support their stated aspirations. Like many, through the height of pandemic, CEDA's program of discussion forums has moved to an online platform. As we slowly return to business as usual, CEDA will return to face-to-face events, and we have in some jurisdictions, but we'll continue to have a really robust program of live stream discussions to make sure that people from all corners of the country can participate in very informed, high-quality discussions on the critical issues. To keep up to date on those events and the discussions on the issues impacting Australia's economic and social development, we encourage you to visit the CEDA website, ceda.com.au. There you can register for upcoming events and watch recordings of past live streams. On that website, you'll also find our regular research publications, our podcasts, our video interviews, blogs with leading experts, all to ensure you can remain up to date with the latest developments in the economy. And today, like at all our public events, you can interact with the speaker, in this case through our Q&A portal Pigeonhole. It's accessible via the link below your video screen. You can also, if that doesn't work, you can enter in details via the website ceda.pigeonhole.at and use the passcode budget, all capitals. If you're really brave, you can jump on Twitter and join that conversation using the hashtag Ozpoll and tagging CEDA_news. Well, in the last week and a half, we've seen the Treasurer hand down the budget and the opposition leader made his budget in reply speech. It capped off 6 months in which you'd have to say fiscal policy has been turned on its head in an effort to limit the economic damage of the COVID-19 pandemic. Fiscal policy, depending on which economist you like to read, is now king, in the driver's seat, or the only game in town. But the federal budget is much more than an abstract concept. It's the key determinant of the pace and nature of the economic recovery that we're going to see and the fate of many jobs and livelihoods. It also remains a key component of connecting people to the services and infrastructure we need and want as an advanced economy during a particularly vulnerable time for our community. And this is exactly why I'm looking forward to hearing from Federal Shadow Treasurer Jim Chalmers MP today. In terms of the format, Jim's going to speak for about 10 minutes, followed by about 25 minutes of discussion and Q&A. So please jump on Pigeonhole and start getting those questions in. But without further ado, I'd like to now hand over to Jim.
Yeah, thanks very much, Jarrod, for the opportunity to join CEDA today again. And to interact on what clearly is, one of the most important opportunities in the budget to deal with a pretty dire set of economic circumstances. I wanted to acknowledge First Nations Australians as well. I'm coming to you from the lands of the Yugambeh and the Yuggera people, just south of Brisbane in Logan City. I acknowledge their elders and traditions, and I acknowledge all the work of CEDA in promoting the kind of conversation that we'll have today and to trying to advance our collective interests, the business community, the education sector, other important sectors, levels of government, to try and work out where we can find common ground, but also to try and tease out where we might be falling short the way that our policies are currently put together and where we might be able to do better. And so in that vein, I'm pleased to be able to talk about the budget, as you rightly said, handed down 9 days ago. And I'd like to say a few things as well about Anthony Albanese's alternative, which was spoken about 7 days ago in the Parliament in the budget in reply. I've done enough CEDA events to understand and appreciate that sometimes it's good to remind ourselves that there are parts of the government's agenda that the Labor opposition agrees with. I think it's good to begin with where there is some common ground. And I think as members may have noticed, there are some areas where the government and the opposition have the same or at least a similar view. Some of the initiatives around tax, around loss carryback, something that we've been talking about and calling for, Clearly, there's a need for some kind of investment incentive, recognising that investment hasn't been that great even before COVID. And we also have supported the first 2 stages of the government's income tax cuts, recognising that there is a need to get some more spending power in the economy. And in our view, that should prioritise in the first instance people on low and middle income. So we begin there with what we support from the budget. There are other initiatives too around mental health and in other areas which we have welcomed. What we tried to do all throughout this crisis is to agree where we can and only kind of disagree where we must. But I think the budget, having said all of that, there are probably 2 broad categories where we think that the budget was a missed opportunity. And I'll try and limit my comments to a kind of an economic perspective, an economic policy perspective. If people have questions about the politics of the budget, I'm happy to answer those when we get to it. But I want to focus on the economics in particular. And I think there's 2 economic critiques that we would make of the 2020 budget. Well, first of all, I don't think there was the right balance between short-term and long-term and across the different opportunities to support the economy. That's the first category of critique. And the second one is I'm not sure we're getting the bang for buck or the value for money that we should be from such an extraordinary allocation of taxpayer dollars. So first of all, in terms of balance, if you think about a challenge of this magnitude, and many of the friends on the call from the business community would appreciate, we're dealing with the deepest recession in almost a century, a full-blown jobs crisis, almost 1 million unemployed, more added to the numbers today, which were released an hour ago. Then we need to recognise that a challenge of this size needs to be broken up into manageable pieces. And I think there are 3 in this case from a government public policy point of view. First of all, how do you respond to the recession? How do you triage workers and businesses and communities? Secondly, how do you recover? How do you kickstart the recovery in a way that gets money into the economy but builds lasting benefit? And then thirdly, how do you reimagine the future and how do we make sure that we can actually increase the speed limit on growth in the economy? And so the first kind of set of issues I think we have with the budget is if you recognise that those 3 stages are very important, there was a bit of triage, there was a little bit of kind of recovery, but not enough in our view. And in my view, the budget was almost entirely silent on what comes next, what the economy looks like after the crisis, and how do we ensure that the economy is growing more strongly, more inclusively, more sustainably after COVID-19 than it was before COVID-19. So that's really the issue of balance. And then the issue of bang for buck or value for money or the opportunity cost of what was allocated on Tuesday night, recognising that we've got over $1 trillion in debt now. We've got $100 billion in new commitments in the budget. You know, are we getting the best value for money from those initiatives? And when you think about the multipliers of some of this kind of spending, some of the things that we're talking about, social housing, childcare, the care economy, energy modernisation, you get far more value for money from those things than you do from some of the things that the government proposed. Some of those proposals from the government are not of themselves unhelpful, but the question, I think, when you're borrowing that much money, we don't have a choice about borrowing or not. We have a choice between whether we have anything to show for it or not. Then we need to make sure that we're getting that value for money. And when you think about it, $1 trillion in debt, $100 billion in spending, we've still got unemployment in the budget not returning to pre-COVID levels, even in the 4-year forward estimates horizon. We're still expecting another 160,000 Australians to lose their job between now and the end of the year. There are still gaps, in my view, in terms of people left behind. If you're unemployed and over 35, if you're on job seeker, Australian women largely left behind in the budget, a lot of groups left behind. And equally on the policy side, a lot of things not done, which, the economists of Australia are kind of scratching their heads about. Why wouldn't you do social housing? Why wouldn't you do care economy and those sorts of things? And also, as I said before, I think the big gap was really a story about where the economy is heading and where people fit into that story. And so what Anthony Albanese tried to do on the Thursday night was to say, look, this is a big opportunity. We recognise there's a need for borrowing, but how do we invest that money more wisely? So we did talk about childcare and workforce participation. which has a massive economic benefit, but also good for families and particularly mums. How do we modernise the energy system, particularly transmission, so that we can get that cheaper and cleaner energy into the system? How do we deal with public housing, particularly the maintenance side, recognising that we can get that work done quickly, it's labour intensive and it builds a lasting benefit? And how do we get more of a training dividend out of the hundreds of billions of dollars that government spends on defence, rail infrastructure and other types of infrastructure by guaranteeing that a portion of that workforce is an Australian apprentice? So those were the priorities that we set out. The final set of observations I make, Jarrod, before we get to the conversation, is to try and think about how this situation unfolds. And I think the best way to understand it, I'd be interested, of course, in your analysis, is that I think the next year is going to look like a recovery on paper, but for a lot of people it's going to feel like a recession. There's going to be a very patchy recovery. There's going to be a lot of pain. There's going to be a lot of displacement. A lot of people who've found themselves without work may have trouble re-entering the workforce. And so I think we need to factor that in. When the numbers start to recover, particularly the GDP number, we need to recognise that won't capture perfectly the experience of people around Australia. And that's why we think, as the Reserve Bank Governor said this morning in his contribution, we can't just put the queue in the rack now and think that unemployment will just be fine or that communities will just recover of themselves. There is some support in the economy, more than usual, but I suspect when the government has subsequent opportunities in the mid-year update in December and the budget in May, that they may need to contemplate some of those things that we've been putting forward.
Thanks for those comments. I think that's set up the discussion quite well and should leave plenty of opportunity for people to jump on and ask questions on Pigeonhole. Maybe if I could start at the really kind of top level, Jim, around a lot of the post-budget commentary that came out sort of cast the government's approach as trying to catalyse a private sector-led recovery and the ALP approach as a government-led recovery. Something tells me it might be a bit more nuanced than that in the reality. But can you tell us, how do you see the role of households, business and government in this recovery? And what does that suggest to you in terms of how fiscal policy needs to be cast?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question, Jarrod. And as you alluded to, I think it's a rather unhelpful simplification and oversimplification to pretend that one of the parties in the parliament wants to catalyse the private sector and the other one wants to, rely almost exclusively on public investment and the public sector. It doesn't bear scrutiny when you think about some of the things that the government has done in the budget, which we have, cautiously welcomed, the things that we've been calling for some time. We talked to the last election, an incentive for business investment. There's been a problem with investment for some time. And so we think it's absolutely crucial. And I personally think, there is no recovery without a thriving, purring private sector. We need to get that part of the economy investing and growing and employing for all of the obvious reasons. It is once again a question of balance. And when you think about that value for money, you think about what you and your counterparts in the economics profession refer to as fiscal multipliers. It seems bizarre in the extreme, I think, to not do things like social housing or childcare, energy infrastructure modernisation, procurement, all of these sorts of things where you get much more bang for buck than for some of the other things that the government's doing in the private sector. So let's not oversimplify it as the government wants us to do. It's not a black and white choice between one or the other. It's a question of balance. And I fear that the government's put all of its eggs in one basket. I hope they succeed, because if it doesn't, that means the unemployment queues are longer than they need to be. But I think a smarter way to go about it would be to spread the opportunities so that there is some public investment where you get that value for money, but also some incentivising business.
And I guess it sort of follows on from that around you make the point around fiscal multipliers. It seems pretty clear that the budget orthodoxy has changed a lot in light of historically low interest rates, the fact that Australia, compared to other advanced economies, has a pretty low debt to GDP ratio and, of course, the dire kind of economic situation we're in. You've suggested that if Labor was in government now, your fiscal and economic strategy would be anchored around a more ambitious approach to employment. I'm interested in what would other aspects, perhaps getting a bit more detail on what that looks like in terms of being more ambitious around employment, but what other aspects you see as being really key to the fiscal strategy, and perhaps a view on what the new budget constraint is. I think this is really interesting just to think about, in this world of low interest rates and debt. Obviously, there's greater capacity for the government to spend, but where do we kind of draw the constraint? And as you say, how do we kind of maximise the benefits from some of the initiatives that we're putting forward for spending?
Yeah. So really, my view about anchoring our fiscal strategy around a more ambitious approach to employment, I'm really referring there to, you would have seen a week or two before the budget, the Treasurer came out and said, we have a new fiscal strategy, and what it means is we will support the economy until unemployment is below 6%. And the reason I think we need to be more ambitious than that is if I think that kind of risks putting the queue in the rack, while unemployment is still unacceptably high. Unemployment, at 6 or just under, is not enough to get the kind of wages growth that we need, to get the consumption growth that we need to boost key parts of our economy. And so I think that was insufficiently ambitious. And so if I were the Treasurer, and obviously, we don't put out in the same level of detail a fiscal strategy, recognising there's a couple of budget updates to go between now and the election. But the point that I would make about that fiscal strategy from the government is that risks pulling support out of the economy too soon before we get anywhere near full employment. And we need something closer to full employment to get some of those other benefits, principally wages growth, that has been absent really for a long time, and not just during COVID-19, as you know and would have observed in the numbers even last year around wages and unemployment. The second point I make about that is when you have such a hard and fast view about the unemployment rate itself, that unemployment rate masks a lot of other issues in the labour market. There's a lot of underemployment. There's a lot of insecure work. And so even if we were to reach some kind of arbitrary unemployment rate target, I think that would still not sufficiently take into account other weakness in the labour market and how we measure it. So how would we do things differently? Well, we've recognised that there is a need to borrow right now. Neither side could choose to borrow or not. Neither side is genuinely choosing now between deficits or surpluses. So that argument that the coalition has been pushing really since the global financial crisis is now pretty much out the window. What matters from our point of view is that we get that value for money. And as you go through the budget papers, and you can't do this on budget day, it kind of seeps out, as you know, over a period afterwards, you see that there is some wastage in the budget. There's lots of kind of buckets of money for ministerial discretion, and we've seen how money's been wasted and misused in the past about that. So we think that there's ways to spend money more effectively. The last point I'd make to respond to your, I think, excellent question about what are the constraints now, and I think it's important that we recognise it's not just let it rip now. And if you read, you spend time on social media, a lot of people who think that the constraints are absent now, and I don't think that's quite right. I still think that we need to be conscious that even with low interest rates, there's still servicing costs, still borrowing costs that we need to be cognizant of. But the main constraint is value for money. The priority is obviously jobs and supporting the economy and kickstarting the recovery and getting our growth back to acceptable levels. That's a higher priority than budget repair, but that doesn't mean that we shouldn't be conscious that this debt has to be paid back at some point, and we shouldn't be asking future generations, and particularly the most vulnerable people, to carry a disproportionate load for that.
Thank you for that. And you mentioned at the end there, talking about, vulnerable people shouldering the load. It is Anti-Poverty Week. And you just yesterday, I think, said that the pandemic has entrenched disadvantages, whether those are around age, gender, geography, and education. There's not really many things that all economists agree on, but it seems that at the moment just about all of us agree that the rate of job seeker needs to be permanently lifted as a starting point to address disadvantage. What's your position on increasing the job seeker payment permanently?
Yeah. Well, first of all, where you began the question, I mean, I think it's absolutely imperative that we recognise that a lot of challenges in the economy, particularly around inequality, social immobility, a lot of those challenges have troubled us for some time, and they've been accelerated by the crisis, not necessarily created from scratch by the crisis. And one of the most important ways that we can deal with that is to agree, as the economics profession has most of the market commentators, as John Howard even thinks that $40 a day is too little to support yourself on and to look for work on. And we've been making that point for some time. And it's kind of unusual in the budget that they hadn't budgeted for an increase. They send out signals that they think that they'll be increasing from $40 a day, but they'll let us know closer to Christmas. We're quite close to Christmas, and I would have thought there was a missed opportunity to kind of let people in on their thinking on what the new rate might be. The reason we haven't nominated a rate is because we've still got to go through that decision from the government, then a subsequent budget. But obviously we've nailed our colours to the mast pretty substantially, and we think that there should be a permanent increase to job seeker. It'd be good for job seekers, but also really good for the economy, which has been held back by a lack of spending power for quite a long time now.
Thanks for that, and will be interesting to see how this space moves in the next couple of months. But based on your comments, it seems that there's potentially another one of those kind of areas that there might be some agreement on, which is potentially promising. I'm just going to move to some of the questions from the audience at this point, and again encourage everyone to jump onto Pigeonhole and ask their questions. We've got a question here from James Copsey from KPMG. He asks, how do we balance the need for longer term structural reform to the economy and the cyclical electoral cycle? And he says, it feels like we are almost in pre-election mode again. What's your response to that one?
Yeah, I mean, that's the big challenge, isn't it, James? How do you get some long-term thinking when recognising that we might be 11 months from an election? And how do you weigh up the economic imperatives and the political imperatives and try and do your best to lean more heavily on the economic imperatives? I don't know that anyone's good necessarily at cracking that kind of dilemma. But my view is, if you think about those three stages I mentioned before, respond, recover, reimagine, I think there's a real appetite in the Australian community for a bit of a sense of what the story is after COVID and how we make the economy and our society better than it was before. And so I'm hoping that a big part of, as we do get closer to an election, I'm hoping that that's a bigger part of the tussle. I'm hoping that, the election will be partly about kind of what's happened, but I hope it will be primarily about what comes next. And, the responsibility for us in that national public conversation is to do what we can to strike a better balance so that we're not just trying to win the 6 o'clock news every night, but we're satisfying that appetite and that need that there is in the community to let them in on, what all these whether or not all these sacrifices have been worth it, whether we're heading to somewhere better than we had before.
And we've got another question around both sides of politics have obviously highlighted some of the opportunities around manufacturing and through the recovery, creating new high quality jobs. What's Labor's plan for manufacturing? A question from Anonymous, who is a regular serial contributor to CEDA's live streams. Thanks, Anonymous. I've been really pleased to see manufacturing come back onto the agenda in a more meaningful way than perhaps it has been. I'm troubled, if I'm honest about it, I'm troubled that even the steps that the government is taking now, are not enough to make up for some of the damage that's been done to the sector the last, 5 or 6 years, I think in particular. We haven't had a compelling story to tell as, the government hasn't had a compelling story to tell post Holden about what manufacturing looks like.
I think we've got no issue with priority setting. The government says they've got half a dozen priorities now. I think all of them were present in the dozen or so priorities that the last Labor government had, and which were ditched in 2013. So we've got no issue with priority setting. We recognise that the CSIRO is doing that quite effectively as well. And, we hope that some of the attention that the government's paying to manufacturing, bears fruit. My personal view is you can't just kind of wake up one day and decide you want to, as a country, do more manufacturing. You need to get the foundations of it right. And that means research and development funding, but it also means getting the energy mix right. And it also means getting the training right so that we're training people to keep up with technological change. And I think if we did those three things, in addition to this priority setting, in addition to making best use of CSIRO and our universities and hooking up our research communities and our investment communities, if we did all that, we do have a chance to revitalise manufacturing, modern manufacturing, in a way that we probably haven't done a great job of the last few years.
Thank you. And just a reminder to everyone, we've still got 20 minutes to go, so plenty of time to get some more questions in. So please do that if you've got one that you want to ask. Jim, we've got a question here that goes to your point around the higher multipliers for employment in areas that you've nominated and that the ALP has proposals on. Question is whether you have any plans in other industries with high employment distributions and spreads, and the question is specifically in relation to aged care, disability funding, whether those are areas that you're thinking about in terms of, I guess, your point around bang for the buck and fiscal multiplier.
Yeah, I think aged care is the really obvious one, and we put out an 8-point plan for aged care, which was focused on workforce, transparency, equipment and the like. And since then, we've had the Royal Commission come out with an interim report on the COVID-specific challenges in aged care. There have been a lot of problems obviously revealed by COVID, but also by the Royal Commission more broadly and the challenges that led to the Royal Commission. So aged care, it's inconceivable that there won't be, by the time of the next election, from one or both parties, a better offering on aged care. The budget did some things about a limited number of places for residential care, but nothing, for home care, but nothing for residential aged care. And obviously that can't endure. There's going to need to be a response at the very least to the Royal Commission when it comes out in February next year. And so ideally we see something in the budget. If not, even better would be to see something before then. That is a labour-intensive sector. It's an area of high need. It ticks many boxes because there are obvious challenges there. And most fundamentally of all, if you take the kind of economics out of it, our older people need and deserve a better standard of care than receiving. So there's a series of issues there that need to be addressed. I think we did childcare in our budget reply because, that was something the government has been, relatively silent about, beyond those kind of triage measures they put in place. We expect the government to move on aged care in one way or another. And so let's see what they propose. And if more needs to be done, then we'll say so at the time.
And you made a comment, I think this has come from one of your comments around company profits growing while wages and household incomes stagnate. And how has COVID changed that? Which is difficult to tell, I think, at the present time. But the question really is around what role other business structures such as cooperatives and mutuals might play in our recovery in terms of giving, I guess, people in the community more of a stake in some of those ventures. Yeah, well, I'll take those two bits in reverse order. I think on the different business structures, I think it's, this crisis has been an opportunity for us to kind of reset and rethink about the way we do business and whether or not, there are more innovative ways that we can do it. I think one of the stunning aspects of the unemployment numbers, not today but a month ago, was a lot of people moving into the kind of gig economy and the like, and that's not the same thing as what the question is talking about, but I think it is an indication that there will be a big kind of reshuffling of the deck. And cooperatives and mutuals might spot an opportunity
in all of that. Now I've forgotten the other part of the question where you began it, Jarrod. I knew that would happen.
In terms of your comment, I think around company profits growing.
Oh, yeah, right.
Faster than wages.
Yeah, so we've been troubled about this decoupling for a while now, and wages have been historically stagnant. Profits have been relatively strong even before the crisis, and now I think we're seeing, with the way that some of the support measures are concentrated, we're seeing that even government support is contributing to that decoupling of profits and wages. Clearly, there's an issue there with the industrial relations system not delivering the kind of wage outcomes that we want to see. Clearly, there's an issue around technology, gig economy, all those sorts of things which need to be addressed. But I think the most important conclusion for us to make out of that decoupling is that it's not been an issue for 7 months. It's been an issue for some years now. And for as long as the current structures of wage bargaining and insecure work and all of that are left undisturbed, then I think we should expect that to largely continue.
And we've got a question from the audience around migration, and obviously this is an issue that's near and dear to CEDA's heart, and we've done a fair bit of work on temporary migration and some work recently on just where temporary migration goes in the next little while. This person's asking, should Australia only begin to restart student and other visas in late 2021 after a vaccine is expected, as assumed in the budget, or should we move faster with safe arrangements? And I guess this goes to the issue around, do you assume that a vaccine is going to be available anytime soon in 2021, or do you look to have better quarantine arrangements that allow us to bring more people into the country?
Yeah. Well, let's investigate whether we can do it sooner, but it's got to be safe. It's got to be perfectly safe for people to sign up to it. Clearly you think about all of the uncertainty when you think about this part of the challenge. There's at least 3 uncertainties here. There's any subsequent outbreaks, like we saw in Victoria, domestic outbreaks. There's the vaccine that you rightly point to, and it's not just the discovery of a vaccine, but the deployment of a vaccine. Everybody's got to get 2 jabs. The government assumes that'll happen between now and the end of next year. I hope that's right, genuinely. And then thirdly, the international scene, which has been getting worse rather than better if you think about the UK and other parts of the world. So there's a lot of uncertainty there. And so let's investigate whether there are safe and responsible ways that we can get some of that inflow going earlier. It's hard for us to tell from opposition what that effort looks like and what conversations may be going on behind the scenes. I think we're also discovering, and I want to kind of tip my lid to CEDA for the work that you do on population. I think you've been on it for a long time, as have we, but we're kind of discovering as a nation just how reliant we are on the right kind of migration settings as a source of growth. And absent population growth in 2019 and before that, growth would have been almost non-existent in our economy even before this crisis. So we need to recognise that. As Shane Wright and other good journalists have written out of the budget papers, we're talking about maybe 1 million fewer Australians than we're expecting over the next couple of years. That's the equivalent of taking Adelaide out of the national economy. And so we've got to do 2 things. We've got to address that, obviously, and maybe there are ways that we can do that in terms of international entry. But secondly, we've got to recognise that if we can't lean as heavily on population growth as we have been as a source of growth, then we better do better on participation and productivity. And that's one of the reasons why we made childcare such a massive priority and what we've been saying since the budget.
Thank you. And I think that goes to one of the other questions, which I'm not sure. This is a bit of a Dorothy Dixer for you, Jim. The question that came in was around the economic benefit of fixing childcare. I think you've just addressed that right there at the end of that comment there around participation and the demographic challenges that we are facing from lower migration and population growth. There's another question here around not just using business tax cuts or incentives or personal tax cuts and incentives, but also using things like personal tax deductions for things like travelling as a domestic tourist to regions or things like that. But it prompts me to ask a broader question. We have seen in some other jurisdictions, incentives for people to eat out in cities and so forth. Are you thinking, do you have any thoughts around kind of broader fiscal measures than we may have thought about to incentivise people to, get back out there and get mobile?
Oh, I think we've got to. I think before we contemplate things like that, and it has been fascinating to see what different jurisdictions have done. In the UK, a Conservative government is buying people schnitzels at pubs, which is pretty amazing. I can only imagine the commentary had we attempted that as a Labor Party during the GFC. But there's been that. In Tasmania, a Liberal government has got tourism vouchers, which are extremely popular and hopefully do the job that they're intended to do. So, there is all kinds of innovation, but I kind of feel like we've got some opportunities missed that are already there in front of us that would do as good a job. You think about JobSeeker. Every single cent of a JobSeeker increase would find its way into the economy. There wouldn't be a cent left unspent, given how precarious people's lives are on unemployment benefits. And so I feel like that should be a higher priority than some of these other things. Same with JobKeeper. We've been critical that the withdrawal of JobKeeper, which does have to happen at some stage, is being pushed too quickly, particularly for Melburnians, particularly for people in places like Cairns, where I was the week before last. So I'd rather we get JobKeeper, JobSeeker right, and I think that there would be it would be incredibly beneficial for the economy in terms of consumption before we need to consider some of these other measures. They're not out of the realms of possibility. They should be considered. They should be on the table, but let's get these other big pieces right first. Okay.
And I guess, again, to this point around, the best kind of value for money that you've made around spending measures. We've got another question around investment in infrastructure. And obviously there's the key one around electricity transmission and the grid. Are there other opportunities that you think that we need to take in the infrastructure space, and do we need to be more ambitious there in terms of nation-building infrastructure longer term?
Yeah, the short answer is yes. But even before we get to that point, one of the big challenges, and I sort of try not to be too partisan about this, but it's difficult in this one specific regard. We've had big announcements about infrastructure for some time, and when you look at what is announced versus what is actually spent, and my colleague Catherine King's done a lot of this very useful analysis, very frequently, in fact, in every single budget, we've underspent on infrastructure. We've had the big announcement, but we haven't been able to get the money out the door, haven't been able to get the project built on time. So as a first priority, if we're serious about infrastructure as a way to kickstart the recovery, and we should be, then let's make sure that the commitments that are made are actually followed through on so that that money flows into communities. And that matters at both ends of the infrastructure market. It matters at the local government end, which is often the most effective stimulus. Maintenance and small stuff is actually, in terms of multipliers, often more fruitful than the big stuff, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be thinking big picture as well. Fast train corridor, all those sorts of things which are really crucially important too. And
this, you have mentioned in your recent speeches this issue of dynamism as well, and I suspect this may become a buzzword coming out of COVID as well. And obviously we're referring to the creation of new businesses in the economy and people switching between firms and all those things that economists like me think are good for productivity and reallocating resources in the economy. What's your views on where the key policy levers perhaps are in this area of business dynamism, and how much of it is simply up to business and other players in the economy?
Yeah, I think it sort of comes back to that trinity of issues that I've talked about before. If you want to get, you want to create new sources of growth, but also you want to create new opportunities within our areas of our traditional strength. You think about the CSIRO, what they do in agriculture and manufacturing and all that sort of stuff. If you think about that equally, then clearly the kind of commercialisation side of things is really important. We haven't done a good enough job in this country turning good ideas into good jobs or good ideas into good businesses. And that's not from a lack of effort. I think it's a lack of kind of coherence and collaboration. We're not as good as we could be at making sure the ideas people are hooked up with the investors. Some of the big universities, obviously CSIRO does a good job of it, but it's not true across the board that we're getting that dynamism from our ideas, and frequently our ideas get commercialised elsewhere, which is not the best outcome for our own workforce. So commercialisation, and then those other two pieces, training for technology and getting the energy side of things right. One of the reasons we haven't got energy right is we've been chopping and changing energy policies for so long. I think if we settled that down, then we'd get some of this investment, and some of that investment would obviously have an innovative bent.
Thank you. We're getting close to time, so I'm going to take one last question, and it's a big picture one to finish off on. And the person has thanked you for your views, but has also asked, what do you think are the 1 to 2 biggest initiatives that could drive economic growth? And I think that's particularly interesting in light of your comment that next year really is going to, technically we'll have some growth, but really, how is it going to feel, particularly as we won't be getting back to the level of the economy that we had at the end of 2019? So clearly we're going to need some big thinking on economic initiatives that can boost growth. What's your view on the 1 or 2 areas that you think are just absolutely essential?
Yeah, thanks for that. This is the best way to think about it, I think. How do we learn the lessons of before COVID and during COVID and apply them to making sure that the economy is stronger and more productive and more inclusive and more sustainable afterwards than it was before? Let me give you 2 examples. First of all, I think we need to recognise that energy policy uncertainty has been a massive drag on growth, and we need to sort that out. We need to agree the basic rules of the road when it comes to energy investment. And then if a Labor government wants to dial up ambition on emissions, or a Conservative government wants to dial it down, as it happens in the UK and elsewhere, then so be it. But business tells me on almost every occasion, can you stop the chopping and changing on energy policy? The government's had 22 energy policies in the last 7 years. We need to sort that out. That will be, if we sorted that out and created a decent foundation of certainty for investment, I think that would be a big part of the story in making sure the economy grows in a stronger and better way than it did before. But then equally, we need to recognise, and the thing about next year looking like a recovery but feeling like a recession for a lot of people, is there hasn't been a recession in this country which hasn't required some kind of place-based specific jobs programs. And I worry that even as the economy in aggregate does start to recover, I'm worried about pockets of our country which are, risk being left behind. And so I think we need to be thinking about specific place-based labour market programs so that we don't have a lost generation of workers that find it difficult to ever get back into the labour market like we've seen in earlier recessions.
Well, I think that's a really important note to end on in terms of the labour market impacts and making sure we have approaches to deal with that in terms of the lifetime impacts that will have on some people. Thank you, Jim Chalmers, for sharing your insights today and taking a lot of questions from the audience, probably more than we would have in a face-to-face event. So I think it's fantastic that people have that opportunity and that access. And thank you for sharing not just budget insights, but much more broadly, kind of the key priorities for economic and social development in the years to come. Finally, I'd like to thank the audience for their time and participation and remind everyone that the discussion has been recorded and will soon be available on the CEDA website to re-watch and share with other colleagues. As I said at the start, you can continue to follow the conversation with CEDA on our website via LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, Facebook, you name it. We're there, so please jump on and follow us. In the meantime, thank you again to Jim Chalmers, MP, Federal Shadow Treasurer, and our audience for joining us today. And please stay safe and go well.
Thanks very much.